fellow travelers. Welcome to the Pilari Presents South Africa podcast, which is a podcast that follows my tour of South Africa as a local, and it particularly focuses on cultural heritage tourism in the country. She's back. I'm just being silly. Um, in today's podcast episode, we are going to, and by going to, I mean we are focusing on the Iziko Slave Lodge. Before we get into that, I would like to share a couple of secrets. Can I share that I feel nervous? I can't remember when was the last time I felt so nervous about producing a podcast episode. But yeah, with this one, I've been feeling very, very nervous because I feel like this history is a forgotten history. And so I want to be very careful how I tell it. I want to do justice to this history. Whilst preparing for this episode, I felt like the academic in me was coming out more than the traveler in me. I was like, no, I want the traveler to be at the forefront of this, not the academic, because I was doing so much research on this. I started researching this in 2022, and the reason why I done such extensive research on it is because, like I said, it's a forgotten history. I did not know about it. It's not something I was taught about in school. I had to move to Cape Town to be able to learn about this history. Other than that, had I not moved to Cape Town, most likely I would have never ever had an idea that slavery was a part of South African history. In the past, when I was younger, whenever I'd watch, movies about slaveries or documentaries about slavery, I would always say, "Ugh, it's so sad that it happened to them, but thank God it did not happen to us." Because I felt like as South Africa, there has been so many unfortunate things that has happened to us as a nation. And so I was glad that slavery wasn't one of them. However, when I learned that it actually was, I was like, why? Why did this have to be one of them? Why do we seem to have been so unfortunate to have so many afflictions happen to us and slavery be one of them? So, yeah, I really, really want to be careful in how I tell this history, because I'm realizing that it's an opportunity to educate. Because if I didn't know about it, there most likely a lot of people who don't know about it. And so this podcast is not just me talking about my experience. It's an opportunity to educate my fellow South Africans about a history that is so brutal, or was so brutal, yet is forgotten. But at the same time, when I reflect on it, as much as I can be disappointed that the slavery is a part of our past, it's a part of our identity, even contemporary identity. When I reflect on it, I can be like, wow, I'm amazed by us South Africans as a nation. Like, what? That shows how far we've come, right? That despite all of this that has happened to us, all of these tragic things that have happened to us, including slavery, look at us now. Here we are, a rainbow nation. That's our brand. a rainbow nation of diverse groups of people with 12 official languages, which means that not only do we recognize one group of people, but multiple and very diverse groups of people as official cultures of this country. And we are moving forward to a future of hopefully forgiveness and reconciliation. Because although we have gotten out of apartheid, we still have a long way to go. Because although we are living amongst one another, we are not integrated with one another. We're still living, in some cases, in our silos. So there's still a lot of reconciliation and forgiveness that needs to happen. But we are moving towards it. We are not stuck in a past of slavery and apartheid and colonization and all of these unfortunate things that have happened. Another thing that I would like to share is that actually this episode or this topic was actually the first topic I had ever recorded for my podcast episode. So when I started toying with the idea of starting a podcast, I had decided that, let me test, myself as a podcaster. Let me test how would I sound. Um, Let me test how I communicate uh, in the spoken word medium. So yeah, I was just testing. It was just a test recording. So I feel like we are finally coming full circle in this podcast. Uh, yeah, because it's finally now officially becoming a podcast episode instead of a test recording, hiding in the shadows, which I might um, possibly put out and share. Do I want to, share that amateur content? um, Maybe I should, so that you can tell me if, I've progressed in this podcasting thing or not. I don't know. Yeah. So those are the secrets or disclaimers that I wanted to share about me before getting into this. So let's get into it. Like I said, we are focusing on the Iziko Slave Lodge, and yeah, let's do this. So let's start with where it is located, right? Before we get into a lot. Oh, I have so much to say about this podcast, about this topic. I feel like we're gonna be here for a while. So grab your water, grab your drink of choice, and relax, okay? The Iziko Slave Lodge is located in the Cape Town city center, on the corner of Wales Street and Adderley Street. Forgive me if I am pronouncing Wales Street incorrectly. To me, it looks like it says Wales Street, but because the H is not there, it could probably be Wale Street. So forgive me. But this is where the Ezekiel Slave Lodge is located, at the entrance of the company gardens, and it's also a neighbor of Parliament. And so let's get into its historical significance. So the Iziko Slave Lodge was built in 1679. And what is historically significant about it, I think it's in the name, right? It is a building that slaved as slaved that served. I mean, I'm not wrong, those could be synonyms. It is a building that served as a slave lodge, meaning that this is where slaves that were owned by the Dutch East India Company were housed when they were imported into the Cape Colony. Another significant thing about, or historically significant about this building, is that although it was forbidden, the building was also renowned as the town's leading brothel. So um I'm trying to be careful with my words here because this is a clean podcast, so I'm trying to be very careful in how I discuss this. So uh, basically, this is not only where slaves were housed, but this is also where masters would go, sleep with their slaves. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just taking it in. I'm just taking it in what I've just said, because that just shows the brutality of slavery. Because I don't think these slaves, women slaves in particular, did this freely. Prostitute themselves to, their white masters. Yeah, we call it a brothel, but uh, were they, did they consent to that? I doubt. Um, did they want to do that? I doubt it. Most likely, they were just forced into those situations because they were owned by the company, right? So it wasn't their choice what they wanted to do, even with their own bodies, right? It was up to the company. So just taking that in. So that's the historical significance of the slave lodge. And so let's backtrack a bit and discuss, you know, how did this be and why did this be? Like, how and why did slavery happen in the Cape, in the Cape Colony? Well, honestly, slavery goes hand in hand with European history ever since the first wave, what I call the first wave of Europeans coming to the Cape. Slavery was always a part of that. Um, So we had three waves of Europeans, right? The first wave was the Portuguese. The second, and the Portuguese I discussed in the the Cape Point episode. So if you're interested in more of that history, uh, go listen to that podcast episode. I do delve a bit more into Portuguese history. So they were the first wave, and they were searching for a different sea route to Asia. And so they happened to, uh, discover the Cape as they were on their mission of finding a sea route to Asia. And then the second wave was the Dutch. The Portuguese, although they discovered and, put a stamp of their nation on the land, they didn't settle. They went back to their kingdom, to their country. However, following the Portuguese came the Dutch. And the Dutch also were trading with Asia. They were trading with the East, hence the name the Dutch East India Company, right? So when the Portuguese found this different sea route, they followed in the footsteps of the Portuguese. So they are the second wave. We're gonna get into the Dutch history as the podcast progresses, because these histories, this history, the Dutch history, is very intertwined with the slave history in the Cape. And then the third wave of Europeans would be the British, whereas the Dutch, they settled. Um, they also colonized. So did the British. And so their histories also overlap one another. You can't separate the Dutch from the British. Their histories, they always overlap and in some instance conflict with one another. But in today's episode, we are going to focus mainly on the Dutch history because slavery, that's where the heart of slavery is at in Dutch history. However, even though the heart of slave history in South Africa is in the second wave of Europeans, ultimately, ever since the Portuguese, slavery was also a part of that narrative. It goes hand in hand. And what do I mean about that? Because in previous episodes I've mentioned, that the reason for Portuguese finding a sea route to Asia was to trade with Asia for spices, right? I cared about how, they were looking for spices because their food was probably bland or their wife's cooking was bland. But it was more than that. It was more than spices. They also traded in fabrics and also slaves. Slaves were part of the products or commodity that they traded in. And so I have a quote here that says that Bartholomew Diaz, which was the first European, according to recorded history, right? We're talking according to recorded history because maybe there were other Europeans that first arrived in South Africa that are not recorded. But Bartholomew Diaz, is the first European to be recorded. And it says that apart from his crew being part of his ship, the ships also carried some black men and women. And so what the Portuguese would do, they would put these black men and women ashore at strategic points to demonstrate the grandeur of the Portuguese nation. So can you see how slavery has always been a part of that narrative of European history, at least in South Africa, in the Cape? And like I mentioned, not only were they trading in tropical fruits or spices and fabrics, they were also trading in human beings, in slaves. So slavery was not only unique to the Dutch. It really was there since the dawn of South African history when we look at it from a European perspective, right? Okay, like I said, slavery has always been a part of South African history. However, it officially cements itself on South African soil with the arrival of the Dutch, the second wave of Europeans. And this is the 6th of April, 1652, the famous date which brought the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, the first governor of the Cape. And the reason why he came here was to establish a Cape refreshment station. And that was a halfway point or a halfway station or like a trading post, right? And the reason why this refreshment station or halfway point needed to be established was because of two things. The first thing was because the health of sailors was at risk. The Dutch East India Company was worried that, you know, because of being on water for long periods of times, um, the sailors' health was deteriorating because of vitamin deficiency issues, right? Because, this is a different time, right? Where you couldn't, people didn't have fridges on their ships, right? So fruits, vegetables, those nutrient um, uh, supplements of food, they would go, they would spoil easily, right, on a ship during that time. And so, yeah, the types of food that they would eat were not as nutritious. And so they needed to establish a halfway point so that they could utilize it uh, as a to provide food, fresh food, to their sailors. That's why it says that at least one sailor in 6 weeks was likely to die on the voyage between Europe and the East. And so the Cape Refreshment Station needed to be established to grow enough food to feed the scurvy ridden sailors. And scurvy ridden means that they were vitamin deficient. And that's where the company gardens comes in, right? Uh, the company gardens was uh, built to, grow these fresh produce that they would give to the sailors. Um, the second reason why the Cape Refreshment Station need to happen is because of shipwrecks, right? In fact, the reason why the Cape Refreshment was established was because of a shipwreck incident that happened on the 25th of March, 1647. About 5 years earlier, this led to the establishment of the Cape Refreshment Station. So these are the reasons why Jan van Riebeeck had to come to the Cape Colony and established a Cape Refreshment Station. So when the Dutch came here, initially it was, a temporary solution, to provide a temporary solution. It wasn't to, be here permanently. At least that's what the books say. Because if that was the case, then why did they stay, right? So, but history says that the intention was not for Europeans to have a permanent residence here in South Africa. It was honestly just to, you know, uh, provide a solution for sailors who were vitamin deficient, or for ships that were being wrecked. So these are the reasons why the Cape Refreshment Station was established. However, when Jan van Riebeeck arrived, he soon realized that he needed labor. He needed people to help him build this Cape Refreshment Station and the company gardens, right? So that they can provide food to their sailors and, provide a docking space where ships can, rest before continuing on. Yet, when he made this realization, he would also realize that the local people were not interested in working for the newcomers, the Europeans, the Dutch. However, he couldn't do anything about it, right? Because the Dutch East India Company had instructed him that he should not enslave indigenous people. If they do not want to work for you, they do not want to work for you. And that's where slavery comes into place. Because if you can't find employment locally, and if you can't enslave the local people to work for you, then you have to look for it elsewhere. And so they imported slaves. And that's how slavery came to be about in the Cape Colony. And so the slaves were important. Guys, can I please say that if you hear background noise, like paper moving or, you know, yeah, mostly paper, just know that, yeah, I am turning my pages. This time around, I have written my notes rather than I have written them on paper rather than typed them on my phone. Usually, I would like, in previous episodes, I would like look at my outline from a phone, but because there's just so much research I made, I had to put it on something that I could easily look at without scrolling uh, through a phone. So slaves were imported from various parts of Africa and the East. And these places included Angola, Mozambique, Zanzibar, Madagascar, Guinea, India, Malaysia, Bali, China, and even West Africa from the what is now known as the Slave Coast, right? And the Slave Coast is that section of West Africa that is now known as Benin. uh, this place is called the Slave Coast because a lot of slaves were kidnapped from here and taken or sold into the transatlantic sorry, my voice is cracking, and sold into the uh, transatlantic slave trade, and therefore they would be sold to America and Britain. So that's the slave coast. And so that was also one of the parts that slaves were important from. And so when they would come here, those slaves would be either owned by the Dutch East India Company and therefore work for the company, do all the labor that the company required, or they would be sold to local settlers. So the conditions that they came to live in the Cape Colony were not cute, guys. It wasn't slavery in South Africa, even though it's a forgotten history. You might, think it's insignificant because it's forgotten. And you might think that nothing major happened because it's forgotten, right? Why would it be forgotten if there wasn't anything significant about it? Actually, slavery was not cute, right? It was not cute. Also in the Cape. We know that it was not cute anywhere else in the world, including the Cape. And so I just want to, kind of give an idea of what conditions the slaves lived under when they would come into the Cape. Uh, First, they would work as household servants or farm laborers. Those are the main uh, jobs that they would do or perform. And other types of activities that they would do included fishing, craftsmanship, and retail activities. And slaves became the labor force which transformed the small refreshment station into a significant agricultural colony. So slavery became at the heart of the Cape Colony because it built the Cape Colony. Without slavery, there is no Cape Colony. And the conditions of the slave were characterized by ill treatment, overwork, humiliation, and degradation. Also, the mortality rate was extremely high. A quote that I have here says that numbers increased not through procreation, but due to the continued importation of slaves. This is what got me, guys. This next quote that I'm gonna read you guys, that really, I think it kind of like shows the brutality of slavery, even in Cape Town. Um, I have a quote here that says that runaway slaves who were recaptured were flogged, branded with a red hot iron on the back or cheek, and sentenced to a lifetime in chains. A second attempt to run away would result in the slave having his ears, the tip of the nose, and possibly his right hand cut off. And so slavery in the Cape was also characterized by a practice of mutilation. Another quote says that runaways were often hanged, which was also the sentence meted out to slaves found guilty of theft. The remains of executed criminals were usually left on display until until they were devoured by scavengers at the place of execution or at the scene where the crime was committed as a warning to the other slaves. So this is the history of slavery and the historical significance of the slave lodge. This is what it symbolizes. And not only this is what it symbolizes, this is what happened in the place. Some of these things that I've mentioned is what occurred at the slave lodge. So let's discuss the attractions that you can engage with when you get to this slave lodge. At least ones that stood out to me. What can you expect when you visit the slave lodge? Well, let's start with the entrance fee. Okay, so the first time I visited Cape Town was 2018, 2019. So the entrance fee back then was 30 rand for adults, and also students and pensioners could get half price, could get into the museum for half price back then during the week. But then when I looked up at the prices, the latest prices, the official site said that the entrance fee is now 60 rand. And I'm sure that students and pensioners do get in for half price, which would be 30 rand now. But here's another interesting thing. On Fridays, if you're a pensioner or a student and you provide a valid ID, you can get in for free. This is what I did, guys. This is what I did. I was like, I am gonna, visit on Fridays. And I don't know if I mentioned it on this podcast, but what I used to do when I was a student back in Cape Town, I used to dub Fridays my museum tour days, right? So in the mornings, I would, do my academic work, which included also not only as a student, right? It also included as a tutor. I was a tutor. I was hired by the university to tutor undergraduate students. So at the end of those classes, I would go to the city center, do a couple of work of my own, and then spend the rest of the day at a museum. So the company gardens has a variety of museums, each holding a different theme. There's one that's focused on art in South Africa, there's one that's focused on natural history, and then there's also the slave lodge. And then there are many others that I have forgotten. So yeah, I would designate Fridays to go visit uh, a new museum each Friday, because my experience of museums is that it's not a quick experience. You have to engage, especially if you really, really want to know about the heritage and the information that the museum has to offer. You have to really sit with the information, read it, engage it, take it in. So I decided that each new Friday I would be visiting a new museum. So that's what I would do. And so if you're a student or a pensioner, do go visit on Fridays. Don't go during the week, because during the week you're still gonna pay some amount, even though it's half price. But rather go on Fridays. Also, when I took my dad to the slave lodge, I took him on Fridays. Yeah, not during the week. But even better than that, even better than free entrance for students and pensioners on Fridays, um, is free entrance on commemorative days. So the Iziko museums, I think it's the museums in general, not just the slave lodge in particular, has a commemorative day campaign where they are committed to making museums accessible to all South Africans, especially disadvantaged South Africans that cannot afford, going to a museum, right? So on certain days of the year, they are allowed free entrance. And these commemorative days include Human Rights Day, which is on the 21st of March, Freedom Day, which is on the 27th of April, International Museum Day, which is on the 18th of May, Africa Day, which is on the 25th of May, Youth Day on the 20th, Youth Day on the 16th of June, National Women's Day on the 9th of August, Heritage Day on the 24th of September, National AIDS Awareness Day, or also known as Slave Emancipation Day, which is the 1st of December. The 1st of December is the date when slaves were officially freed legally by law. And then the other final commemorative day is the Reconciliation Day, which is on 16th December. So if you want to visit the museum and you want to do it affordably, either go on Fridays or do go attend during one of these commemorative days. So let's get into attractions. What can you expect when you visit the slave lodge? Well, these are the places that stood out to me. The first one is an exhibition. It's actually a documentary exhibition about the Merman slave rebellion, which occurred in 1766. So, what happened here? Uh, this documentary tells the story of slaves that were imported from Madagascar to the Cape. However, before the ship reached to the Cape, the slaves rebelled. Unfortunately, the rebellion failed. Um, yeah, I'm not going to go into the details of that. There is a documentary that I, ran into on YouTube that tells this story about the slave rebellion that happened on the Merman ship. Um, the documentary on YouTube is called Secrets of the Dead, Slave Ship Mutiny. So just if you're interested in learning more about that rebellion, just do a quick Google search and you should find the documentary. It's 8 years old, I think. So yeah. So this was the first room that stood out to me. Another attraction that stood out to me was the replica of a slave cargo ship. And so what this section of the museum attempts to do is to display the ways in which slaves were transported as cargo in ships. And by cargo, we mean property, commodity, uh, treated as stock. you know, stocked goods. Oh, guys, when I saw this, I was so saddened. I was so saddened because there's an illustration on the wall that tries to show, how the slaves were, organized in slave ships. And it's so sad to think that for months, for weeks, these are the positions that slaves had to remain in until they reached their destination. And so, what these illustrations show is slaves lying on their backs, um, chained to one another, and they couldn't move from this position until they arrived. Of course, there were some exceptions. Not all slaves did this, because if this wasn't the case, then the Yemen slave rebellion wouldn't have happened. The Yemen slave rebellion happened because the captain or some prominent figure on that ship allowed the slaves to move about freely on the slave ship. However, generally, what would happen is slaves were expected to lie on the floor of the belly of the ship, chained to one another, and they couldn't move from this position. And this means that they had to lay there in their feces, in their urine, some in their vomit. So they had to lay there in very unhygienic conditions because you could not move. But even though you could not move, the body, won't stop performing its functions, right? So this really, really broke my heart when I saw how brutal slavery was, not only when they arrived at their destination, but from the moment they left their destination, or even before they left the destination, because in order for them to be sold into slavery, they had to be kidnapped, right? Another room, and this was my favorite, one of my favorites, was a room that is an exhibition of cultural artifacts. And what this room does is indicate the geographical and cultural links of slaves. So it displays African and Asian objects, and such as clothes, toys, jewelry, music instruments, tools, and yeah, it just tries to show the slave origins. So it shows the types of identities that they were stripped of. Because usually when you think of slavery, it's easy to think of them as these peasant people who had no importance in society or the societies from which they were kidnapped from. Yet I remember when I walked into this room, and oh guys, the artifacts, they're so beautiful. I remember seeing this coat. I think I think it's Chinese. It comes from Asia. As this outfit, this attire being displayed there, and it was so beautiful. It was so regal. It really showed that whoever owned this piece of clothing or this combination of clothes had a high status in the society that they come from. So, therefore, these people were not insignificant. They meant something to the societies that they come from, even if they did not have public roles in their society. They had families who cared about them, loved ones, friends. Um, they had people who cared about them, who admired them, who respected them. They had important roles in the societies that they came from. So, yeah, I thought it was a very beautiful display of different cultural um, artifacts. And it also shows how the beauty from which they come from. Because, slavery does really, it's an ugly thing. Even today, the images we see of slavery in movies, it's very ugly. But it shows that, these people come from something beautiful, that they are more than that ugliness that they were forced to, live in, that ugliness that they were forced to, occupy. So yeah, that was really, really one of my favorite. It's very rich, it's diverse, it's beautiful, beautiful music instruments, beautiful jewelry, beautiful things, and it breaks my heart, guys. It really breaks my heart to see people come with these things and then have them stripped from them. And not just the things, but the identity. The identity. Which takes me into the next thing. There's another room, and this was also another of my favorite, which is a portrait exhibition of people with calendar month surnames or last names. If you don't know what a surname is, um, whoa, so you walk into this room and you see these images of faces as portraits of different people, and each portrait has a month of the year written on it, starting from January all through to December. Some are written in Afrikaans, others in English. So some images will have January, another will have Maart, which is an an Afrikaans way of saying March, and then the other one will have like uh, August or what, Augustus, right? Hey, Afrikaans, guys. I haven't been speaking it in such a long time, so my tongue has forgotten a little bit of some Afrikaans. So forgive me. But yeah, and when you read what this exhibition is about, it shows the legacy of slavery. It shows the legacy of these people, the 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 heritage which they have inherited, right? So what would happen when slaves got to the Cape in particular is that not only would they have their cultures stripped from them, they would also have their personal identities stripped from them. So what I mean by this is that they would be given new names, right? So this was another way of stripping slaves of their identity by giving them new names, and these were the names that they would be called by for the rest of their lives. And generally, what slave owners would do is name the slaves according to the month which they had arrived to the Cape. So if I arrived in Cape Town as a slave in let's say July, then my name would be Peladi July or Peladi Yuli, right? Because like I said, some of these months would be written in Afrikaans, not just English. And then in other cases, the names that they would be given indicated the place from which they were imported from. So let's say if I was taken from Madagascar, my name would be Peladi van Madagascar, which means Peladi from Madagascar. And if I was a slave born at Cape Town, then my name would be Peladi van der Kap, which means Peladi from the Cape. So this is what this room tries to exhibit. These people who are descendants of that, of ancestors that were brought here as slaves and then given these last names, Yuli or Van Madagascar or Van de Kaap. So yeah, I remember being in this room and coming to the realization why somebody whom I had known, why their last name was what it was. I won't say what their last name was out of fear that they might come across this podcast and then learn that I was talking about them. So I'm not gonna say which month it was, but I remember that person was a student of mine. Like I said, I was a tutor in Cape Town. Not only was I a student, I was also a tutor. And so I remember just, whenever I'd mark this student's work, I would always think to myself, why is their last name this? Like, who would call themselves after uh, a month of the year? Why? And I also remember, I can't remember if this was the same student or another student, but I remember overhearing other students gossiping and laughing about some student. I can't remember if it was the very same student that I'm talking about or another student, and they were laughing at the fact that the student's name, was a specific month of the year. And I remember when I walked into this room and realized what this room is trying to teach. I remember just thinking, oh, wow, this is why. This is why that student's last name is this. And then it broke my heart even further when I remember, overhearing certain students gossiping about and laughing about a student who has, a calendar month surname. And it just made me realize, the importance of being compassionate to one another, to not judge one another. If you are curious about something, ask, right? Instead of laughing about it. I really did not have the guts to ask my student that, because I felt like, some lines shouldn't have been crossed, especially considering, my role as that student's tutor. So I asked the questions in my head, but I never asked them or asked that specific student. And so, yeah, if you come across a person who has a calendar month last name or surname, be compassionate. Yeah, maybe some of them do not know that they have that surname because they are a descendant of a slave. But still, don't laugh, don't laugh. Be compassionate. Yeah, it just really, really broke my heart that, they were laughing at something that was so brutal, even though they did not know it, even those students who gossiped were not aware of it. But still, when you look at it, like, wow, they were laughing at something that is so painful. That is so painful. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, let's be compassionate to one another, even though the people who are descendants of slaves do not know that they are descendants of slaves, because some of the people who, were whose portraits were part of this exhibition, they were interviewed, and some of them did say that all their lives they did not know that their surname was what it was because they are a descendant of slaves. They only made the realization when they were being interviewed, for the exhibition, that they are they are descendants of slaves. So that also shows what I'm talking about when I say that history is forgotten, right? Not only by South Africa in general, but also the descendants of slaves. And I can understand, why that would be. Like, what parent or grandparent would want to tell their their descendants or their future generations that they were part of that they were slaves, you know not maybe because they are ashamed, because it's not their doing, but maybe they do not want to talk about that past. They do not want to talk about what they had to endure. So sometimes families tend to keep certain histories hidden because they're painful to talk about. So, yeah, let's move on. Another attraction that I think is a must see, although it's not within the museum, yet it's still a part of the museum. It's just located outside of the museum, and this is the slave auction tree. Well, it's not a tree anymore, but there is a memorial built of one of the slave auction trees where slaves were bought and sold. And so this memorial is on Spin Street. So if you get out of the museum and turn right on Adderley Street, and then turn right again onto Spin Street, you will find the memorial. It's called the Old Slave Tree Memorial. This memorial represents one of the trees where slaves were bought and sold. So this is where slaves lost their agency. So I have a quote that says, "Groups, even families, were broken up and scattered at auction sales, there being no obligation on a buyer, for instance, to purchase a mother as well as her children." So these were places where families were torn apart, husbands and wives were torn apart if they did, build a life for themselves uh, under their status as slaves. Like, imagine that you're married, you have children, but you can't have a say on, you know, on your future as a married couple or as a family. That right is given to another human being who, can come, and if they like how you look, if they like your physique, if they think you're strong enough to do the work on their farm, can just come and take you away from your children and your husband and your family or your friends. It's just thinking about it, I can't even put myself in those shoes where I am forced to be separated from my parents or my relatives. Like, I can't have a say. And not only can't I have a say of whether I stay or go, even when I get to the farm, I can't have a say of what job I do. I can't have a say of what farm I want to work at. So it's just brutal. It's just heartbreaking to think that there are people who had to live such lives. And it's even more heart-wrenching to know that their descendants are amongst us as South Africans. it was easy to be desensitized about slavery when it was far away, when it was not, according to my ignorance, it was not a part of our history. But now that I have awareness, and I know that, these people are amongst us, the children amongst us, it's like, wow, like, what, it makes it also real. It makes it also real. You see that it has a legacy. It has a legacy. It's not just a dead past. It's still a living, real reality in contemporary society. So that's the Slave Lodge and the attractions you can see when you visit the Slave Lodge. I highly recommend that you go and visit the Slave Lodge. Um, it's a painful past, so you have to really, prep yourself for it. It's not ugly, what am I trying to say? It is ugly, but it's not traumatic. Like, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not traumatic going into the slave lodge. I remember the first time I went, I was afraid. It took me a while to get into the slave lodge. Once I understood what does this building represent, because from the outside it looks like a very beautiful building. You wouldn't say that this history that I just, mentioned occurred in that building, or that's what that building represents. Because the slave lodge is the actual building where slaves were housed. It's not a representation. It's not a mock. It's it's the actual building. Slaves lived there. Slaves had to, or were forced to, prostitute themselves there. So it is the real deal. And so I was afraid, or not afraid, but hesitant to get in. It took me a while to convince myself to get into the slave lodge, because I was afraid I'd see horrible things. Horrible. I was afraid that I'd walk out and be traumatized. But although it's heartbreaking to learn that this is or was a reality of Cape Town, it's not traumatic. Um, okay, so in a previous recording or post, I had mentioned that I would make connections to how the slave lodge connects to what's happening in the current state of the nation. This is where we get to the current state of the nation segment. Are you guys still with me? I hope you're still with me. Stick with me. We're almost at the end. We are almost at the end. So stay with me. I hope you're still with me. So this has to do with Trump, right? Recently, Trump made threats to South Africa. Well, can we still call them threats now that there's an executive order that's been put out against us? But how this started was that Trump made threats against South Africa to withdraw U.S. financial assistance from South Africa because of the Land Expropriation Act. And this is because of the assumption that he has and his government had made, uh, where they thought that South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. We would soon later learn that those certain classes of people are Afrikaans or Afrikaners, because, you know, Trump's government would announce that they have given them refugee status, whoever wants to accept that status. And then after that threat, he put out an executive order against us on the 7th of February 2025, which was to like show that he's serious. So how does this whole saga around the Land Expropriation Act, how does that tie in with the Slave Lodge? Well, in a nutshell, it is because of the abolishment of slavery or the emancipation of slaves that the free burghers would quit the Cape Colony and trek into the interior parts of the country, those being the eastern and northern parts of the country. And as a result of that tracking into the country, they would dispossess African tribes, indigenous local groups of people of their land, and they would also this would also lead to apartheid, which would eventually uh, legalize the dispossession of land, right, and displacing indigenous groups of people from their land. So this is how it ties in. When slavery gets abolished, when slaves get emancipation or get their freedom, the Afrikaner nation that was formed in the Cape decides to quit the Cape Colony and go into the interior parts to form their own colonies. So let's backtrack a bit. Let's backtrack a bit. You know me, I like to backtrack. I like to really put all of this into perspective instead of just give an overview of it. So, how did we go from 1652 with the arrival of young Van Riebeeck to 2025, where we have this whole international debate around the Land Expropriation Act? So, guys, I could easily read out these quotes and it would give you the story. I had to do so much research around this. I read widely. I even read a Bantu education textbook that I got. It was my mom's textbook that I found when we went to my grandmother's house recently. And so, yeah, I read widely. I read very, very widely, not just for this part, but just slavery in general. And that's why I felt like this topic was so heavy. And I'm so glad that we are finally recording this and it's going to be put out there and I'm going to be free of it. I'm going to be free of slavery. That's me being silly, guys. I'm being silly. Please forgive me. Okay, so let's backtrack a bit. So when Jan van Riebeeck arrives in 1652, he wasn't the only person who arrives. There were also settlers that came, and that kept coming, right, in the years following that, in the centuries following that, right. European settlers from Holland, Germany, and France. They came to settle at the Cape, and then all these people amalgamated into one nation or into one group of people, which would eventually be the Boer nation, the Afrikaners, right? So yeah, this is what Afrikaans is. Afrikaans is an amalgamation of all of these different languages and different groups of people. That's why I remember, guys, there was a time where I was watching Titanic, the movie. Of course, what other thing is there from? Well, there are a lot of documentaries. So I was watching the movie, and I remember watching an American movie and hearing Afrikaans there. I was like, what? What's happening? Why is there Afrikaans in an American movie? It was when Jack uh boards the ship, and then they find these German, I think it's German people who already had occupied the rooms that they were going to share with Jack and his friend. And one of those German people turns to another German person and goes, "Wars wen?" And I was like, ah, Afrikaans. Okay, guys, I'm being silly. So yeah, when I read this, I'm like, I made the connections. I'm like, okay. So Afrikaans is like It's an amalgamation of German and all of these other European languages that are not English. Okay, I finally get it. All right. And so they form one nation, but however they officially become a thing in 1657 when Jan van Riebeeck gives farms to the first freeburgers. And who are the freeburgers? Well, the freeburgers were men who had been allowed to quit the service of the Dutch East India Company to work for themselves. So usually or typically the reason why these settlers would come to the Cape Colony was to work for the Dutch East India Company, right? Remember, like I said, it wasn't meant to be a permanent uh, settlement. It wasn't the intention was not to build a new nation or to colonize. The intention was to create a Cape refreshment station. And so not only did they import slaves, but they also brought, European settlers to come and work for the company. And when they were done with their service, some of them would go back to Europe, to their homelands. However, there were those people who decided to quit the service, but not only quit it, but to also remain in the land, right? In the South African land, or what now is South Africa, the country, right? uh, so yeah, they wanted to become independent. They wanted to stop working for the Dutch East India Company, and so Jan van Riebeeck gave them land. However, naturally, with being landowners, they also required labor. And so they hired slaves. Well, that's what the Bantu education textbook says. Hired slave. Hired slaves. Hired slaves, guys. The irony of those words. It's like an oxymoron. Hired slaves. How do you hire a person that you forced into your labor? Hmm? Okay, let me not go crazy on you guys. Yeah, I just found that to be an oxymoron. Guys, sometimes these things frustrate me. I'm sorry if I'm bringing those frustrations to the podcast, but yeah, so they naturally required labor, right? And so because they weren't allowed to to enslave locals, and because locals did not also want to work for them, they refused to work for them. They bought slaves from the Dutch East India Company, and so eventually many of these free burgers would own a lot of farms. Like, remember, there was a quote that I had read that said that slavery would be the core of agriculture, communities, or life in the Cape. Uh, because, you know, that's the labor that they used to build their farms, to build the Cape Refreshment, to eventually build the Cape Colony. However, in 1806 or 1807, one of those 2 years, the British Empire would annex the Cape Colony for a second time, right? Remember earlier I said that these two European waves, they overlap one another. This is where we see that overlap. Annexing essentially means the act of one country taking over another country, usually by force. And so this is what happened. The British comes and takes the Cape Colony over from the Dutch people or empire. I don't know if there was or at least the Dutch East India Company, right? And so when they annex the Cape, they end slavery, they abolish slavery. And as a result of this sudden emancipation of slaves, many owners went bankrupt because their farms came to a standstill. Remember, their farms depended on the labor of slaves. And so when there was no more slave labor, many of them went bankrupt. So because of this, the free burghers and their families decide that they're going to quit the Cape Colony. They're going to organize themselves into groups. About 10,000 free burghers decided that they're going to migrate from the Cape to the interior of the country. I have to mention that although slavery was very significant in this decision, it was one of the significant causes of the Great Trek, which would eventually be known as the Voortrekker movement. Um, it is not the only reason why they left. It was one of the reasons. There were also other political and economic causes that led to the free burghers tracking into the interior. But economically, slavery was a major, major issue. And so they decided to track into the interior. And I have a quote from the manifesto of one of the leaders of the Voortrekker movement. His name was Piet Retief. For those people who might argue that you're lying, the Voortrekkers didn't, you know, migrate because of slavery. People like to argue. So I like to come to my debates with facts, okay? So I like to come to my debates with facts. I don't argue because Jay. I feel like it. I argue because I'm informed, okay? So in his manifesto titled Manifesto of the Immigrant Farmers, Piet writes a summary of why they have taken this decision to migrate from the Cape Colony. And in the second section of this manifesto, he says, we complain of the severe losses which we have been forced to sustain by the emancipation of our slaves, and the vexatious laws which have been enacted respecting them. So, yeah, even though it wasn't the only reason, it was clearly one of the reasons. So, as a result of them migrating, right, from the Cape into the interior, African tribes get land dispossessed from them. They become displaced. And like I said, it would eventually lead to apartheid, which would eventually legalize this dispossession of land. However, I want to focus first on the aspect of uh, dispossession, because I want to make it clear that, yes, in many instances, the dispossession was very violent and forced, but in some cases, the dispossession was a part of a negotiation, right? Because there were many wars that happened around that time in the 19th and 18th, 19th, yeah, 18th and 19th centuries. Because of this, the Freeburgers got into wars with the different tribes, the African tribes that they came across. And also around this time, the British were also colonizing the land. They had formed another colony in Natal. And so they were also moving interior into the land. And so was it not only this war or wars between the Freeburgers and African tribes, but also a war between Freeburgers and the British and African tribes. So it became a very violent period of wars, and I'm not gonna go into the detail of that. However, in some instances, African chiefs would negotiate either with the British or the Freeburgers uh, uh, to protect them, right? Because they had advanced instruments, right? A spear compared to a gun. The gun is more advanced, okay? Even though we don't like to admit that they had much more powerful weapons than us, they did. You can shoot a gun from across a field. You don't have to be close to a man to kill him, as with a spear, right? So, to negotiate their protection, one of the incentives that African chiefs would use was land. They'd say, oh, we'd give you a piece of our land, or would give you our land. And, or in some instances, like I said, it would be a piece of their land, but somehow the British maybe would trick them into a deal where at the end of the day, they the African chief and his tribe would lose all of their land. So it's a very complicated thing. Yes, it was forced, but in other um, instances, you know, the Europeans were given title deeds. They were given these title deeds to African land by African chiefs. Okay, so yeah, that's what I wanted to just emphasize. And so, from this history of war and violence, then comes apartheid, because the Voortrekkers would eventually uh, establish their own colonies, the Transvaal colony and the Orange Free State colony. And from this would then also evolve apartheid, right? And apartheid basically means segregation, right? Where the white people were trying to segregate themselves from black groups of people. And so this is where the land expropriation comes in, because although there was this dispossession that happened for over 2 centuries at least of South Africa's history, starting in 1654, um, the Land Expropriation Act actually uh, tries to redress the Native Land Act of 1913, because this is when the dispossession of land was legalized, right? If you want to learn more about the Native Land Act, you're welcome to listen to season 1, episode 10 of my podcast, um, where I discuss Saul Blackie and Mhudi, his book. And I do not only discuss Saul Blackie as a literary figure, I also discuss him as a political figure. And so that's where the native policy comes in. Native policy is 4 policies that the white union had, you know, put into place to marginalize black people, right? If you want to go into the details of that, please go listen to that podcast episode. And so the Native Land Act of 1913 was one of those 4 policies, which would be dubbed native policy. And yeah, what the Land Act essentially did was, the aim of the law was to compel service by taking away black people's means of independence, creating a land shortage in the reserves in order to force Africans into the service of white industry and agriculture. Can you see the themes of slavery coming up again in this act, where initially, because of a shortage of labor in the Cape Colony, slaves were imported, right, to fulfill that gap. And now, later on in the 20th century, we see similar themes where they used policies to force African people to work for white people. They forced them into positions of economic servitude, economic slavery, essentially, uh, so that black people were forced to work for them. And the only way they could do that, or one of the ways they could do that, was by taking land from people, black people, and or people of color. And essentially, um, what this meant was that black people, who are in the majority, right? The demographics are in the majority. They would own 7 to 13% of the overall land of South Africa, whereas white people would own at least 70% privately owned 70% of the land. And that is still the case today, guys. That is still the case today, where there are not a lot of black people who own land. A lot of private property, private land is owned by white people. And so the Land Expropriation Act is trying to redress this, to bring justice to these past laws that racially discriminated against, African people, that resulted in them losing land, and losing their independence, and being economic servants, and still being economic servants to this day. Okay, so the legacy of that law still lives with us today. And so the Land Expropriation Act is trying to address that. However, I must mention that the land expropriation, or the concept of land expropriation, is not a new thing. It's been with us since the dawn of democracy. The Land Expropriation Act is an addition of Section 25 of our Constitution, our supreme law, the law that governs this country. And this Constitution, might I add, was negotiated by the National Party with the ANC during the CODESA talks, right? And CODESA was where the National Party and the ANC negotiated to end apartheid in South Africa. And so, as a result of this, came the interim constitution, which eventually would become the official constitution in 1996, right? So this is not new. This is something that we negotiated with this is what was negotiated by the ANC, because I wasn't there. Okay, I was there, but I was a baby. Okay, that they negotiated, with the white government of the time. That yes, land expropriation, can be a policy of the new government. However, now, since then, there has been, what's the word? There has been, for lack of a better word, I'm just gonna say there has been, why is my English leaving me, guys? There has been frustration. Yeah, I think I'll choose that word for now. That's the word that popped into my head right now. There has been frustration around the idea of land expropriation with compensation, because people felt like it's just putting disadvantaged people, or people who are already disadvantaged in a position of disadvantage, right? It just continues to disadvantage them, because when land was taken away from them, back in 1913 and even before that, it was by force. Nobody paid them. Nobody paid them for their land. And now here we are in a post apartheid democratic country, and we are asking those disadvantaged people, people who are already disadvantaged, who have nothing, and we are saying, if you want your land back, you have to pay for it. Where are they going to get the money to pay for it? They're already at a disadvantage. And so what this new or revised act was trying to do is to really define that notion of nil compensation. Nil compensation was no compensation. So it's trying to define what are the processes of expropriating land without compensation. What justifies land being expropriated without compensation? Um, that's the specific aim. I'm trying to be very careful here because it says many other things, but let me say that's the thing that has caused a lot of controversy in the country and internationally. This idea of nil compensation. It made people assume that, all land would be expropriated without paying the owners. However, I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. This act tries to it still stays true to the Constitution. In fact, it adds onto the Constitution. Even when it starts from Section 25 and says, okay, this is where we're starting, this is where we're moving from, this is our foundation, but maybe this is what needs to be revised. And let me tell you, what does it mean when it says nil compensation? Well, when you go to Section 12 of the Act and read subsection 3 of Section 12, you will see that it says, it may be justified and equitable for nil compensation to be paid where land is expropriated in the public interest, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including but not limited to A, where the land is not being used and the owner's main purpose is not to develop the land or use it to generate income. C, where the owner has abandoned the land by failing to exercise control over it despite being reasonably capable of doing so. This is not all of it. This is just some of it. But I wanted to show you that this act is not trying to, steal land from anybody. It's just trying, as it says, to identify certain instances where the provision of nil compensation may be just and equitable for expropriation. And it's in this instances where land is not being used to generate income or where land has been abandoned. So meaning that the government or any expropriating authority cannot go to land where the owner is still using it to generate an income or where the land is still being passed on from one generation to another and has not been abandoned, where it will continue to have an owner, right? So if you can read, guys, you are saved. Nobody's trying to steal land from anybody. If it's not justified to expropriate land without compensation, it won't happen. And also, white owners are allowed to refuse an offer. They have a right to refuse an offer if the amount is not what they want it to be, or if they don't even want the land to be expropriated from them at all. As it continues to say that the amount of compensation must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between the public interest and the interest of those affected, including an owner. I say it again. If you can read, you are saved, guys. This debate has been so annoying. I am annoyed by Trump. I'm annoyed because, his decision, his executive order has has so opposes, right? Because to my knowledge, this has been put on pause for now. It hasn't yet gone into effect, but it poses a risk, to so many disadvantaged people in this country who are relying on that assistance from, US funding, right? I do not know the specifics of, what this money did, but I'm assuming, it's called financial assistance for a reason, right? And the people that are benefiting from this are the people that, you know, need the help, right? And so I find it very annoying that because of some confusion, because of not going to read the law, because of listening to sensational propaganda, there are people whose lives, whose well-being is at risk because of politics, because of false assumptions. So I'm very annoyed, guys. I am very annoyed. And I felt the need to really educate on this act and not only just show the links to how, we got here, but also to eventually educate it. Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this act mean for South Africa today? I hope I I did a good job of that. I am so tired, guys. I think this is going to be the longest post in the history of Pilari Presents South Africa. I'm going to try to edit it down, but we'll see. If it's essential to keep information, I'll keep it in. But yeah, I think I've said everything that I needed to say. Um, but you know what? It doesn't have to begin and end with me. Let's continue the conversation in the comment section, guys. You can comment on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, you can comment on Spotify. If you're listening on Spotify, the only place where you can't comment is Apple Podcasts. So, um, if you have something to say, if you want to correct me, or if you want to add to what I've said, you're welcome to put your opinion in there. I I do not consider myself as a person who knows it all. I'm I'm learning this as I go along, as I travel. I'm learning this along with you guys. Like I said, before I traveled to Cape Town, I did not know about slavery. And therefore, I wasn't able to make the connections, or I wouldn't be able to make the connections that I'm making today. So yeah, I am not a know all be all. I I am open to other people's opinions, to other people's disagreements. Um, so if you feel like there's something I missed, or there's something that needs to be elaborated on, or if you disagree with something that I have said, please feel free to put it in the comment section and we can discuss it. We can discuss it. Um, and hopefully other people can also, jump into those conversations. So you're welcome uh, to doing so. And I am very much open. I feel like, I'm struggling to end those podcasts because I feel like, there's still so much that can be said. I feel like there's so much more I can still do or say about this. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm trying my best. And so and I welcome you guys to also do so, especially in a time where we have outside parties who are trying to divide us as a nation. We cannot allow that. We cannot allow people who know nothing about our country, who won't even take the time to study just one document that they're basing their decisions on. We cannot allow them to interfere in our politics. We cannot allow them to interfere in what we're trying to move towards as a country, which is forgiveness and reconciliation. We cannot allow them to take us back. We've come too far, guys. We've come very far. And so we need to fight, guys. We need to protect what we are trying to build as a country. We need to protect the future that we're trying to build, not only for ourselves, but for our children, which is a future that is of unity and social cohesion instead of division and hate, instead of prioritizing certain groups over another. I don't understand who said that Afrikaans people are not a recognized community of this country. Their language is one of the 12 official languages of this country. So how are they not recognized as a group, as a culture? I mean, even in schools, some of us were forced to study in Afrikaans. So how is that a marginalized group when your language is a language that forms the basis of so many subjects and knowledge, that students are taught in? Afrikaans, they are a recognized group of those people. This is their home. Yes, we have a very controversial history, but it doesn't define us. It shouldn't define our future, and we shouldn't let an international presidency that so far looks racist to divide us. Yeah, but at the end of the day, guys, to all black people, to all white people, to all colored people who are especially the descendants of slaves, especially in the Cape, to all of us, let's not allow people who do not understand anything about us, who won't even take the time to visit us or study our past or our laws, to divide us. We have to just continue to fight for our democracy. He's trying to ruin the democracy in his country. He's trying to turn it into an autocratic government. Let's not allow his messed up ideas infect us. Not only for ourselves, but for our children. And I'm gonna leave it there. I'm sorry, guys, for being a maniac. in this episode. But like I said, I'm annoyed. I'm annoyed. And with that said, that's it for today's episode. I hope that you guys are all good. Um, don't forget to comment if you have an opinion and add to this conversation if you feel the need to. Keep good. Make good choices. Yes, make good choices. Make good choices not only for yourself, but for this country, for the future generations of this country. And until then, I will talk to you in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Oh